You're listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Now, it is time to break it down.
Welcome to episode number 9 of the Sonny Brown Breakdown, a podcast where we discuss the training, teaching, health, and education of mixed martial arts to help you find the difference that makes the difference. I'm your host, Sonny Brown, and in this episode, I talk to Rory from RVV BJJ. Rory is a Rob Bernanke black belt who runs the RVV BJJ YouTube channel, where he takes a methodical approach in explaining the science behind your Jiu-Jitsu. And here we discuss the principle of alignment involving posture, structure, and base, maximizing your training and drilling time, why beginners shouldn't train close guard, and dealing with false positives or low percentage moves. Now let's go to the podcast. Rory, great to have you here today, mate. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me here. And we've been trying to get this together for a little bit now.
We have. It's this gap in everyone's work schedule has been good to try and catch up on some of these plans I had laid out. So yeah, I've been a fan of your work for a while. You've got a great YouTube channel, RVV BJJ. And
yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great resource. I reckon everyone should check it out. The videos that turned me on to you were the Gordon Ryan floating pass.
I think that's the only reason why I have any notoriety or success on YouTube right now is because of that series.
I found that really helpful. I mean, it's a great series. And I had done a seminar with Matthew Tesler, one of the Danaher Death Squad brown belts. He came out to Australia, did a seminar on floating pass, and I picked up things from that, but actually going to your videos really made a lot of the stuff he was showing click for me. I think there's that benefit of seeing it in competition, and how you were explaining it was a great addition to how actually Matthew Tesler himself was explaining it. So I think that's a good compliment to your work.
Excellent. Yeah, that was a fun one where I hadn't done something like that before, where I had done a deep dive, really going through hours and hours of competition footage that I could do, even having to pay for flow grappling, which I hated doing, but just so I could see some more matches. And I originally only had a plan for like 4 parts, but as I kept on going through more and more footage, as I'm sure you know, we have a plan when we're making a video, kind of. And then as we keep on taking in more information, all of a sudden it's like, oh man, I have to change this. I have to add this. That part is so cool here. And it became like 17 parts and completely overblown.
But yeah, 17 parts of quality content. So yeah, I thank you for putting that together. And one thing that comes through in your videos, and a thing I noticed in those videos, was your approach to thinking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You had a very analytical approach. And then when I realized your instructor was Rob Bernanke, that kind of made sense to me because I was somewhat familiar with his work. And so I'm just wondering, your history with Rob, how you got into Jiu-Jitsu, and how that has influenced and shaped your thinking towards the sport.
Yeah, it's not hard to tell that I am a student under Rob Bernanke if you know his work and then you listen to me speak. I originally started martial arts at 19 years old, which was 11 years ago now. And I started in German Jiu-Jitsu, which was Japanese Jiu-Jitsu with kickboxing, essentially, if I was to just kind of break it down basically. And so we trained it, but we were also doing a no-gi submission grappling for fun. And I found that I was naturally getting more drawn to that stuff because just doing the live sparring in jiu-jitsu, as we all know, it's just a blast. And to get to actually pressure test this stuff starts to cut out the fat of things that don't work. And so what started happening for me is I was getting into security workforce where I was doing bouncing, I was doing uniform work, I was doing loss prevention where I caught people stealing in stores by just pretending to shop all day. And when I was getting into physical altercations, trying to arrest people and apprehend them, I kept on resorting to grappling. And I found that not all, but a lot of the Japanese Jiu-Jitsu Aikido stuff that I was working on at the time for 3 to 4 years at that point was just stuff that I wasn't able to replicate in a adrenaline-filled, high-intensity situation, like actually having to use it in a street defense situation. And so I kept on just moving further and further away from that stuff and focusing on the grappling. Unfortunately, that school ended up shutting down just because there wasn't enough students. And I was training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Nanaimo, just at some random places, because we didn't have a very good level of Jiu-Jitsu for Vancouver Island, which is like the far western side of British Columbia, Canada. And then Rob opened up shop and he moved in. And we heard that there was a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts in the area that just opened up a shop. And so the great thing about Jiu-Jitsu is that we get to roll and we get to test and we get to see if people are actually legit, because the mats don't lie. And so I went at Rob with everything I had, and he absolutely mopped the floor with me, crushed me. And so at that point, I was just like, man, this guy can absolutely mess me up. I know that I can learn from him. And then the 7.5 years that I've been training with Rob now, he's obviously opened my eyes up to a conceptual approach to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is what I try to emphasize for myself when I'm teaching, especially on the YouTube channel, to try and have something that differentiates from the rest of the many YouTube videos out there, especially on Jiu-Jitsu. And I've got to see how good of an instructor he actually is, which is not something that, like, I knew he was good and that he was way better than me when I was obviously a white belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and he could mop the floor with me. But all the way up to now, where I'm now a black belt under him, I can now see why he is regarded as a high-level instructor across the world, and why he actually has some notoriety now across the world, and why guys like Yuri Simões now has got Rob to come out 3 times now to help him with ADC camps, which is absolutely insane. As Rob's developed relationships with Caio and Yuri Simões, that he's the real thing. And I've been very fortunate to learn from him.
Yeah, I knew, he had that relationship with Caio and Yuri Simões, and he seems like a very switched on individual, I'll say, and knows what he's talking about and has a good way of expressing it. And one of the things that I see you talk about a lot and Rob talk about is this concept of alignment, which I believe you, have broken down into base, posture, and structure. And you say that this is the most important concept in jiu-jitsu. And I think everyone, if you've been doing jiu-jitsu, you would probably have an intrinsic understanding of this in one way or another, but you've really laid it out well for everyone. And I wonder if you could, go over that for people who maybe haven't heard those terms thrown around yet.
Yeah, so alignment is the overarching concept of everything that we do when there's physical performance involved. So alignment is our body's ability to generate and absorb force maximally and relative to our goals. And so the relative to the goals part is the really important part, because jiu-jitsu is so complicated with all the different positions that we have, that what is considered good alignment isn't the easiest thing to recognize at first. But alignment is comprised of 3 things. We have posture, the integrity of our spinal column. So for the most part, being able to keep our spine straight obviously allows our body to act as a kinetic chain, connecting our lower body to our upper body so that we can work efficiently. We all know, and we've all been taught from a younger age, don't lift things with a curved back, and do not try to explode in positions with your spine twisted. And so if you can keep your spine relatively straight, like even a little bit of a rounding to it is usually quite natural in certain positions, you're going to be able to be more effective. Then we have structure, which is the efficient, effective positioning of our limbs and relative to our goals. And so this is talking about our arms and our legs and what our goals are and how we need to have our limbs positioned. So frames is a concept that we hear getting used a lot more now in jiu-jitsu, where we're talking about using rigid supports, rigid structures to be able to support weight and to generate some force, or to keep distance between us and our opponent, which we're using our bones to be aligned in a certain way to be able to achieve that. So locking my arm out would give me structure as a frame that now I'm able to support a heck of a lot of weight. Versus, say, like if somebody is trying to arm bar me, then obviously I don't want my arm to be fully extended in this circumstance, because my goal is to keep my arm from being extended. So I want to get my arm in super close to my body. I want to cover it with my other arm on top. And even if I can start bringing my knees up to my elbows and starting to shell up as much as I can, I'm going to become more efficient, and I'm going to be able to resist a higher output of force to keep my arm from being pulled away from me. So structure is usually the hardest one to understand when it comes to jiu-jitsu, because it is the one that changes most often. Base is a platform from which to apply and absorb force maximally relative to your goals. So for us, base is almost always derived from the ground, obviously, but sometimes it can also be generated off of our opponent. So like, for example, if I was just using a recumbent guard, supine guard off of my back, and I have my feet on my opponent's hips, I'm going to be able to mobilize my hips and lift off by creating a bridging motion by having my feet pushing into my opponent's hips. And because I drive into my opponent's hips and my opponent's feet are then connected to the ground, I'm still generating force in a way off of the ground, but it's through my opponent. And so base is one that's is extremely important, because obviously if you can't generate force, then you're not going to be able to make any of these techniques work. So something as simple as live toes, in which you have your toes actually curled, engaged into the mat, rather than dead toes, as we call it, where you have just the flats, the tops of your feet just sitting on top of the mat, is going to allow you to be able to generate a lot more force. So alignment, like the example that I usually use when I'm trying to explain this to someone on their first day, is think of weightlifting. There, we're very used to that you have to have a specific alignment for each different exercise that you're trying to perform. So the alignment that you need for bench press is obviously very different than the alignment that you need for a squat or a deadlift. But there's a very specific way that you need to have your structure, as in your limbs, aligned, a very specific way you need your posture aligned, and a very specific way that you need your base aligned, so you're going to be able to generate the maximum amount of force to be able to perform the movement safely, as well as being able to optimize the efficiency and the effectiveness of how much weight that you can actually move. So it's a big, broad thing that I try and wrap into every technique that I teach, where is the alignment? Because for us, the goal in jiu-jitsu is to keep yourself in alignment at all times and to break your opponent's alignment to create vulnerability, and then you move forward, whether that's just moving forward in passes, in dominant positions, in sweep attempts, or especially when we're looking at submitting somebody. I don't think that you can submit somebody unless they're just not moving at all if you don't break their alignment. If I can stay in proper alignment and I can make somebody a fraction as effective as they normally would be by breaking their posture, structure, and base, doesn't matter how good they are at jiu-jitsu, because they're not going to be optimized to fight back.
Okay, so that's a good understanding of those concepts that we can give to students. You mentioned that you will explain it to students while you're teaching techniques. So I'm wondering, how in depth you'll go on those ideas when you're teaching techniques. But then how do you actually get them to internalize those concepts?
So for us at Island Top Team, Rob's Academy here in Nanaimo, British Columbia, we do a half-hour, 20-minute introductory class for everybody, where we meet up with the students right before class happens, and we go through those concepts specifically and show it with like the example of the technical stand-up. And so this is where I will spend 20 minutes to half an hour talking just about alignment, frames, and levers with somebody on their first day to help them kind of understand what's going on. And typically, to first help them internalize what's going on, is I'll show them the movement and I'll teach them how the concepts are taking place, but then I'll also have certain ways that I will rest weight onto them or have them try and complete the movement, and I screw them up by just grabbing their leg and pulling it out or pushing them over, so that then they can see through a process of success and failure why all of a sudden a movement, all of a sudden, at the end of the 20 minutes, it's become much easier for them to hold or perform versus when they were first trying to do it at the beginning of class. So that's where I will really go on tangents talking about that stuff longer. Otherwise, in class, depending on what our movements are, for us, when we first are teaching like our 101 fundamentals curriculum at Island Top Team, the emphasis isn't on submissions, it's on learning how to control your own body and then learning how to control your opponent's body first and foremost, as I was talking about. Learn how to keep yourself in alignment and then learn how to positionally control and break your opponent's alignment. So there is going to be a lot of overlap, and we will be talking about that stuff. And so whenever I'm teaching that technique, I'm usually going to first be like talking about how we're starting in the position or how we're going to move into that position, keeping ourselves in alignment, and then what our goals are, depending on if we're looking at taking the back or just moving into mount, knee ride, guard passing, sweeps, what we're going to be doing to affect our opponent's alignment with specific movements. So they always, instead of me just saying, place your foot here and then push on the hips with the tripod sweep to knock them over. I'm telling them that we're placing a frame against our opponent's hips. We have both legs controlled so that we're limiting how much they can base, so that they're unable to actively post or recorrect for the force that we're going to be generating into them. And then we're tipping their center of gravity outside of their platform of support, which is going to now cause them to fall down. And so it's going to be something that's always explained through each one of these techniques. I'm never going to just tell somebody to do a certain move, regardless of how small it is. Every grip, every placement on our opponent, every placement on the ground has to be able to be explained with logic and with the concepts behind it, because jiu-jitsu is governed by these concepts of physics, stuff like gravity. It's always there. We can't ignore it. And so I'm not going to tell somebody that they have to grab somewhere on the gi for just no reason. I'm going to tell them where they have to grip it. It doesn't have to be as exact, like, oh, it has to be exactly 3 inches down from the collar, or 3 inches around on the sleeve, or this exact spot. It has to be able to be related to a concept, whether it has to do with alignment or a frame or a lever, a wedge, center of gravity, momentum. Stuff explains that these students understand the purpose behind the movements that they're doing and why it's important to do it right.
Okay, that makes sense, giving them that real meaning behind everything they're doing from a scientific perspective, I guess. So you definitely have that science-based approach to jiu-jitsu. I wonder, how do you look at the way you approach things? Do you consider yourself, working in a science lab compared to how, other people might do it? Would you say that other people might be more looking at it like an art and you guys are taking the science approach? Or do you feel that, science is the approach to take with jiu-jitsu?
Well, I think that good jiu-jitsu that we're seeing is going through a scientific approach, because what we do, competition is what sets jiu-jitsu apart from everything else in the live sparring aspect. So for us, we get to see a filtration process of guys at the highest level, and that's where we try and draw our techniques from, and what we try and use as the threshold for what we think is effective is we want to see high-level black belts competing on the world's biggest stages and seeing what they're doing and what works. Because what we try and say always at the very beginning is we're teaching our students to beat black belts and the world's best black belts. The reality, it doesn't matter if someone's a hobbyist or if they're only looking to come in a couple times a week, or if they have no aspirations of ever competing or ever even trying to be that good at jiu-jitsu. I want to teach somebody how to beat somebody that's really good at jiu-jitsu. And then that way they're covered for everything underneath that. What I'm not interested in teaching somebody, and this is where I have a problem with stuff like the self-defense stuff and how it's taught, is we're going to talk about the big drunken haymaker that somebody throws at you, and we're going to work on only that. Well, the problem is that then when you go up against somebody who's really skilled, you're not covered for that, and you're going to get lit up. But if you know how to defend against a proper jab and cross and hook that a trained boxer would be throwing at you, then when a drunk person tries to slap you across the face, it's extremely easy, or at least easier to deal with, depending on obviously all the variables in that given situation. So for us, we want to observe stuff working at the highest level. And so we're constantly observing, which is a big part of the scientific method. And then for us, the conceptual framework allows us to see whether it's us trying to come up with our own little variations of techniques, or we're trying to break down and explain why somebody is doing something. Like, so for me with the Gordon Ryan series, I'm looking at this, I'm seeing Gordon use these techniques at the highest level. Okay, so something that Gordon is doing here is working very well. And now I'm going to try and explain through these concepts of posture, structure, and base, frames, levers, and wedges, and center of gravity and momentum, etc. to, is this holding up? Does this make sense? Which obviously it is holding up because he's making it work at the highest level, but this is where we see stuff where, whether we want to consider it the artistic approach, there's a lot of crap on YouTube and Instagram, as I'm sure you can agree, that we see where somebody just shows something super flashy and cool. Everyone's just loving it on the Instagram feed. And I'm personally looking at it going, that is absolute garbage. It is never going to work on anybody good. It starts to rival on kata levels of just, you're almost doing it like a dance where you're doing this against a cooperative opponent. But if somebody actually knew what they were doing and wants to shut it down, while the move looks cool, it's fundamentally incorrect because the person's doing it with broken alignment. They're bending their leg up in some super flexible way that externally rotates their hips that, one, a lot of people wouldn't be able to do, but let alone it puts you in this compromised position that makes you more prone to injury and will not allow you to generate as much force as you would if you kept yourself in a better alignment with like a leg press motion. And so that scientific approach, we observe stuff work at the highest level. We can then start to break down why it's working at a fundamental level, the conceptual level, and then attempt to replicate it. And when we're doing our own replication, it's through an experimentation process where we are obviously working with usually lower level people at first. And then as we start to gain success with that, the goals are to consistently keep increasing the resistance and the skill level. So you start, when we first start drilling something, we work something with a white belt, and we just kind of keep on like playing around with our white belt students and just doing the move to them over and over again, or even a couple times in a round. And then you start testing it on the blue belt students, the purple belts, the brown belts, the black belts. Then you start cross training potentially, and you're training with other black belts. And then you're trying to make this stuff work in competition, which is obviously the highest level that we're looking to achieve. And then if you can make it work in competition, aside from the fact that we have to account for the variables of, like, obviously there's no rules in the street and these yada yada multiple opponents, if you can make stuff work in competition under stress, then you're also going to be able to have a higher chance of being able to make the stuff work in a self-defense situation. And so that's where I think, like, that's where sport and self-defense becomes very combined in their effectiveness. But that scientific approach, it has to be tested, and that's how we know where a technique is valid or not.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, especially that as long as someone's doing well in competition, then you have to imagine that they're going to be good in a self-defense scenario as well. I know there's some people think that sports jiu-jitsu takes away from that self-defense side, but I do feel that if someone's good in the sport context, then they're probably going to be able to translate that to an untrained attacker. And it's funny you mentioned the Instagram stuff. That's something that now with, you called it a dance, and I've kind of settled on thinking of it as a pro wrestling demonstration now with people just putting on the best moves that they can possible for the camera. And I think it's certainly an interesting aspect of the sport that's taken over a lot of people's time, it seems. But when you go into them mentioning how you drill, one concept that I know you guys do, or one method, is something called F your Jiu-Jitsu. And I thought that was really interesting. You mentioned about being able to, work your skills up along, from white to blue to purple. But you have this, interesting way of drilling that, well, I'll let you explain it. Gives people some resistance, but gives them the opportunity to work as well. I wonder if you can explain that a bit more.
Yes, Rob's really good at naming stuff, and so he calls it F your Jiu-Jitsu. For the kids class, we just call it frames and levers, or if I'm going to be teaching seminars on the stuff, frames and levers is a great way of just explaining it when we're trying not to just swear in front of people or keep it up more professional context. But F your Jiu-Jitsu is really just like positional sparring. It's just going to be in the bigger areas of usually guard passing and guard sweeping would be like the two main areas that we emphasize this kind of training. And so what we're doing, because those areas become so broad and there's so many different ways that these scenarios can play out, is that we place restrictions on the individuals while they're doing it. And so if we're going to talk about, say, F your Jiu-Jitsu sweeping, this is for the person on bottom to develop their sweeps. So the person on bottom is not allowed to go for submissions. They can play any guard they want, and their job is to sweep their opponent. The person on top is not allowed to try any guard passing, is not allowed to pass their training partner's guard at any point, and they're not allowed to go for submissions. Their job is to purely just prevent the sweeps from occurring. And how deep they let their training partner get into certain sweeping positions and guards is kind of up to them and their comfortability as they're getting used to it. So for me, like if you and I were to do a F your Jiu-Jitsu sweeping round, I would just walk over top of you. And my goal is to allow you to establish any kind of guard you want, which is probably going to be your best guards, especially if I'm not shutting you down, which is a great way of training with people when you first meet them, whether it's just in a sparring aspect or you get the sparring and the drilling out of the way first, and then you're going to get subsequent training sessions in. I want to see what people from other gyms are going to do that's going to be different than what I'm used to, because obviously every gym is going to have a different set of techniques that they're usually very developed at. And so I am going to stop you from sweeping me, but this is the playful part that's hard for people at first, is that they're not comfortable controlling their center of gravity and their base or just their alignment in general. But if somebody puts me in X guard, now I can be very comfortable balancing on one foot and then accessing the legs as levers, grabbing up at the toes or grabbing the gi and unwinding control to get myself back to whether it's just off of my opponent, where we'd be creating that distance that we'd be able to start initiating guard passing within a regular kind of sparring instance, or just staying on top as long as I can and just seeing how long I can stop my opponent from being able to sweep me. And now the great part about it is that if they sweep me, we just reset, because what we do is we do a 6-minute round, 3 minutes each for a turn. So as soon as my training partner has swept me and has actually consolidated the sweep, which is a big part of what I think people really suck at lower levels when it comes to sweeping, is that they can knock their opponent's butt to the ground, but if they're not effectively controlling the legs, denying their opponent's ability to generate base and get back up or just run away, and then the sweep doesn't actually matter. You have to knock the person down, you have to then keep them down and then get up yourself. And so that part, there is a fight. Like, I'm not just going to let the person come up on top. They have to knock me down, and then I'm going to try and get back on top of them. But if they do seal the sweep and put me down, then we just reset. And so that's the part that I think is extremely important with these kind of ideas when we're going to be drilling sweeping or guard passing, etc., where I'm able to be playful and the consequences are minimum, in the sense that I just get to experience that there was failure, and hopefully I can start to pick up why there was failure on my part so I can correct it, but I get to go right back to it and experiment and play with it again. I can even try and put myself, like, if I get into your X guard and you sweep me, then great, that's fantastic. I'm going to now try and get back into that X guard, that same position, because now I want you to try it again and I want to see if I can correct it. And so we get to be playful with it, and we get to increase our exposure in these certain areas without that punishment, where say, F your jiu-jitsu guard passing, the person on bottom now is only allowed guard retention movements. They're not allowed to establish any kind of guards or grips or hooks or clamps on your opponent that would slow you down. So essentially you just stay like on a ball on your back with knee elbow connection, and you're not going to let your opponent pass your guard by any means. And you can certainly grip the gi or grip their opponent's wrists or head if it's needed to for a specific guard retention movement, but you're letting go immediately. The person on top is now unobstructed and able to throw as many passes at you as they want because you're not holding them down. And so they get to work on their passing and their combinations. And if we were playing like that in a regular round and you pass my guard, I'm now going to have the experience of the cross face and just dominant pressure from somebody where it's like, oh man, I want to work on my guard retention. But if I fail, I'm now going to get crushed for the next 5 minutes until the round's over. So that sucks. I didn't get to really maximize my efficiency training in this one area. As soon as the person has passed my guard within this drill that we're doing, they just immediately go back to passing my guard again. They give up the position, they go back. So I get to work and maximize my time in areas. And that's what we're trying to do with those, where it's just about maximizing the efficiency in certain areas through exposure. And that's so just like any positional sparring, when someone's working on side control or mount or back control, it's the same thing. It's just for us, we're doing it within those areas of guard sweeping and denying sweeps, as well as guard passing and guard retention, which is an extremely important area that's hard to develop for new people. And then we also do it with top control in the sense that instead of doing it like side control, like the traditional sparring where I'm going to just try and hold side control as hard as I can, and if I can use heavy pressure and crossface and underhook, I can hold you there. There's a place for that, absolutely. It's very important to practice that. But we like to also emphasize movement. And so when we do, it's going to be top control sparring, but I am not allowed to establish chest-to-chest connection with my opponent on bottom. So when I'm controlling side control, I can go knee ride. I can use my arms to pin their arms or to control like their gi to try and break their posture, but I'm not ever allowed to actually drop myself down, establish chest connection, and use that for direct rotational control of their body, because that's in our mind, the lowest form of control, in the sense where I can stop my opponent from moving, but it doesn't take a lot of finesse or work to be able to necessarily do it. And we want to encourage our students to experiment and play with different ways that they can use levers to execute rotational control over them. And through that, they will fail. But through that failure, they will learn how to correct that, because then it just becomes through a process of elimination, plus also just adaptive learning, where they're going to be seeing failure and success kind of on the fly while they're sparring.
Yeah, I really love that idea and love that concept that you've got there of just being able to get people to maximize their training time, giving students that opportunity to fail and fail quickly, and then they can have the opportunity to correct those in the same round or the same allotment of time. And yeah, I can't wait to get back on the mats and play around with that a bit. And one of the things you touched on there is the maximizing of training time. And I know you put out a video that said, I guess that one way to do that was to have white belts not actually train their closed guard or not use closed guard, which was, I think it had a bit of a controversial title or something. But you still mentioned then the importance of guard retention. So I wonder if you can explain that, how you can, justify with the importance of guard retention, not having beginners train their closed guard.
Okay. So there's a idea in traditional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that closed guard is like the ultimate weapon. And it is very powerful. But the problem is with closed guard is that it's extremely effective at the beginning. And then closed guard, you don't see it as much at the higher levels. And that's not to say that it's not effective, because Sean J. Ribeiro is armbarring people from closed guard at 80cc. It's an extremely effective guard, but it is very hard to master. And so it becomes a safety net for beginners, and people will always take the path of least resistance. And when we're talking about egos on the line, especially for beginners, like when we're tired and people need to survive a round or try to stop their guard from getting passed or to delay a tap, being able to wrap your legs around somebody and just clamp really tight, it really shuts people down. If you took a 300-pound white belt and just told him to wrap his legs around me and squeeze and just hold it for as long as he can and not try anything else, even as a black belt at 180 pounds, it's going to be quite difficult for me to get out of that. They're not going to be effective. They're not going to threaten me in any kind of way. And certainly if there was a rule set like MMA or self-defense where I'm able to strike that person, then closed guard's not actually going to necessarily be the dominant position there. But in jiu-jitsu, without strikes, we can hold closed guard with no consequence. And so this is what we see too often. When I was training jiu-jitsu with my friend Jimmy before Rob had opened up shop in Nanaimo, our rounds were either a lot of great jiu-jitsu because Jimmy could not establish his closed guard on me, or he caught me in closed guard and we spent the entire round there. And I'm sure whether it was just someone who's really good, or especially when you're first learning, you've probably had this where you were stuck in somebody's closed guard for an entire round. Now, it's important to develop closed guard and our defenses against closed guard and have those kinds of rounds. But for us, we do not allow anyone under blue belt to use closed guard while sparring in the gym at Island Top Team. And that's because we want to allow people to continually move and be exposed to more jiu-jitsu. So when someone is forced to develop their guard retention, or even just like more open guards, like say De La Riva, which is a great option for someone who's looking to first pick a guard to develop. De La Riva, you still have less control over your opponent, and you need to be able to less control in the sense that you can just spam a move and just hold somebody like a cheat code. You have to know how to cause kazushis, off balances to affect your opponent's alignment. You need to be able to quickly chain sweeps, because if you just get a De La Riva hook and grab your opponent's ankle, you can't just hold them there for as long as you can with closed guard. And so with that, they're going to develop more dynamic sweeps, and their partner is going to have more ability to actually try and chain passes. So they get better, and they get to shut down De La Riva as well. And then with that, because the person on top will have an easier time shedding the control, especially at lower levels who don't know how to control these guards, they're going to be able to throw those passes, which then will force the person on bottom to have to use more guard retention movements. And so that's like the key part is instead of focusing on this one area like closed guard, because I know some people are very traditional and they're like, no, closed guard is absolutely where you need to start. It is the fundamental basis of jiu-jitsu, which I don't agree with. People will develop that closed guard. And yes, if I get stuck in that person's closed guard, it's going to be a nightmare. But if that person can't wrap their legs around me, which is not a very hard range to stay away from at first, especially when we're standing, because closed guard isn't really the appropriate range there to try and engage, then I find way too often people all the way up to brown belt that I've trained with, where they're so good at closed guard, but as soon as they're unable to establish that range and play that game, their guards become very easy to pass. And so for us, it's just about, as you're saying, what's the way to maximize exposure to all the different kinds of jiu-jitsu areas that we need to develop, rather than giving somebody this one power move that they can hold on to. And it allows them to survive or even win in a round. But jiu-jitsu, when we're learning in the gym, it's not about winning. And that should not be how we're trying to measure success. It's about how much we're getting exposed to different movements and overall development of our game.
Yeah, well, that seemed like a controversial statement when at the start, but I think you've explained that quite logically as a way that... I
found that on Reddit too.
Yeah.
Reddit, people were, there's actually, it was the first time, and the thread's still up there as evidence, where people would disagree with me at the beginning, and then as I make those logical points, which are all the points I'm just parroting from my instructor Rob Bernacki. He's a brilliant practitioner and instructor. But once we make those points, then people look at it and go, you know what, actually, I think I agree with you. And it's like, holy shit, did we just have a internet discussion that was civil and where I actually changed somebody's opinion? Mind-blowing.
That's rare. That's very rare.
So
especially in this day and age. So that's a good testament to the foundation of your idea, I think, for that's even possible.
Yeah, and then obviously if we're practicing a competition, then we have to have our white belts and blue belts start to spar with the closed guard. And so we'll do that within positional sparring rounds, or the higher belts will use closed guard on them, because like I said, white belts aren't allowed to use closed guard, but a blue belt could use closed guard against the white belts if they wanted to. So it's one of those, like, one's allowed to use it but not the other, because obviously we can't have these stipulations in place and then send one of our white belts into a competition where they're most likely, like most white belts at other gyms, closed guard is the first guard they work on. And so if we have that informational asymmetry in place, then we're just setting white belts up to go out, and it's like, yeah, they're super good at passing and they're super good at staying on top, but if they get stuck in closed guard, they're absolutely screwed in this situation. So we never want that. So we do try and set them up for success the best we can by still making sure we're developing it. We're never avoiding something entirely, because ignorance is never the right response for anything.
Yeah, well, that's opening closed guard for white belts just in general seems to be one of the biggest sticking points, especially in competitions where people do just lock down on it like life or death, which I think even gives more credence to what you're saying before about it just being maybe too powerful of a position for people to be able to hold. You mentioned at the end that, yeah, ignorance of things isn't good, which of course I'm in agreement with. But then we also do mention about training only the high percentage moves. So I'm wondering where you would fit like low percentage moves into teaching students just so that they're actually, aware of things. Is that something that you have to balance? Will you show a low percentage move just so that they've at least seen it, or will you teach it legitimately, or will you put a caveat on something when you show it? How do you tackle that?
Yeah, so whether it's kind of where we had first talked about this stuff in the past, where we were talking about calf slicers. I have a video where I shit on calf slicers, and I think that they lack effectiveness at the highest levels. But in jiu-jitsu, almost anything can be dangerous if somebody does not know how to react to it, whether it's because the move itself does have a certain degree of effectiveness, whether we're talking about just the mechanical strength of the move, or because somebody just doesn't know what to do and they end up twisting or yanking the wrong way, and then they can certainly just hurt themselves. So anything could be potentially dangerous. And so for us, say something like the Americana. Here's an example of a move that is mechanically strong, as in it will absolutely devastate your shoulder through external rotation. But it is not tactically plausible. It's very hard to actually establish the figure four for an Americana, regardless of where you are, but especially if we're looking at it from Americana, key lock from side control, top side control. So I will show the students how the move is done so that they can understand it and they can understand the risk of it, and they can start to, so the person can, one, learn how to do the move, because I want to teach every student as if they're going to become an instructor one day. And so they need to know how to teach these things, even if it's something that they don't. But then the person on bottom also then gets to experience this thing, this Americana being taken to an extent that they feel that they need to tap while drilling within a gentle, safe environment where we're just passively repping back and forth on each other. So it's very important for them to know that and to experience that. And then we'll show them how to shut it down. Now, I don't care if somebody ever, like for me, I can't tell you the last time I drilled an Americana. Like it's just, it's one of those moves that it's very simple to do if you actually have it. Like I've definitely spent like a couple full days probably like training this thing over the years when I was lower belts. So it's like, I know how to perform the move effectively, but it's quite simple once you get it. It's just a matter of actually setting that thing up. So some of those moves, I don't think much time needs to be spent on it, but certainly we need to still show them how it works, so that one, they know what the move is, so that I don't have like a purple belt where if someone's like, hey, can you show me a key lock? They're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. That wouldn't look good, as well as then I can't know that they're going to know how to defend that. And so if we look at calf slicers is a move that does still work up to an even higher level, where typically when you're seeing this stuff happen, when I was doing the little bit of research I was on calf slicers in just grappling events, not MMA, that typically they ended up topping out at around brown belt. And so you'd see brown belt fight to win events or jiu-jitsu competitions where the calf slicer is starting to happen, but they're no longer happening at brown belt. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why I think that's happening, but it can absolutely still hurt people. And even for myself, as I'm a black belt, but my knee, I have a hard time compressing my heels to my butt. Through a bunch of flexibility of workouts and stretching, I can now do it much more comfortably when I'm warmed up. But I would be one of those people that is more susceptible to actually getting damaged by a calf slicer. So it's one of those, like, it will work. It just is dependent on certain variables in a situation, which is typically someone's flexibility, which at the highest level, most people are very, very flexible, more so than the average person. So we have to go over the calf slicer. I have to show people how to do a calf slicer. If they want to try a calf slicer, it's one of those moves that it's kind of a stopping point along the way of taking the back anyway. If we're looking at it from, say, a basic truck position, that I don't have a problem with somebody doing a low risk, low percentage move. So they're not trying to go for something where if they shit the bed with it, they end up on bottom or even possibly getting their guard pass. That would be unacceptable in my eyes. But for something like the calf slicer, they can be in the truck position, they can check the leg out, they can test it. If it doesn't work, no big deal. Go back to controlling the opposite side of their opponent's body and just keep migrating towards the back and then try and finish them from there. So under that, from its tactical plausibility, I'm fine with it in the sense that it can be done safely and from different ways, and we don't have to give up position. It's just not mechanically strong enough in my eyes to be something where if somebody wants to spend time developing a system around it and their whole game, it's like, okay, you're going to have success at all these different levels. And if their goal is not to compete at the world's elite stage, then that's fine. But I still think that it's worthwhile to be training at moves that are always effective no matter what. And so it's always about just introducing somebody to the move and then making sure that they know the defenses to it. So that's where we'll make sure that they know how to train, how to apply a calf slicer the best that they can. So then now we can start working on the defenses for that. And then that way, hopefully, if we're working on defenses to a move that these people also know how to do, we're starting to mitigate the false positives that would be in play, in the sense that, like, if I teach somebody how to do a calf slicer poorly or only allow them to spend 5 minutes on it, and then I start working for the rest of the week on defense to the calf slicer, then these students are going to develop defenses against a really crappy calf slicer. And then they're going to think that they're really good at their calf slicer defense, when in reality, the person that is trying to apply the calf slicer just really sucks at it. And so even these low percentage moves, I still need them to be effective at them so that they can at least help the development of the defensive movements, which is ultimately the more important thing the goal that I'm trying to reach when I'm teaching students.
Yeah, I like that, to focus on just, giving them that introduction, but making sure they know the defense as a way to teach those low percentage moves. That really clicks for me, makes a lot of sense as,
Yeah, because any move will be potentially dangerous.
Yeah. And yeah, as you mentioned, any move being potentially dangerous, you brought up the idea of a false positive. And I think that's a really good concept from science that can translate into jiu-jitsu, because it's something that I know when you explained it, it's something I know that I've fell for myself in the past with a move that, I've hit a couple of times in training, and then I've spent way too long trying to replicate it again and not being able to get that, the same effect I got those couple of times. And I wonder, can you explain, is what that idea is to you of false positives in jiu-jitsu, and, how that can hinder people's development?
Absolutely. So a false positive is basically look at it as a cause and effect fallacy, where A happens, so B happens, so therefore A caused B. And so what typically happens is that you apply submission on somebody, and so we think that submission is awesome. But what we don't know is that there's a bunch of other variables at play. So when we're looking at something like, say, the calf slicer, I apply a calf slicer to somebody and they tap to it. I think, therefore, calf slicers are amazing and that they work. But we might be negating the idea that maybe this person has just never trained leg locks before and they don't know it. And I think this was one of the calf slicers more prevalent at brown belt, and then they start to fade out at black belt, is that because of the bullshit IBJJF rules on leg locks, people aren't allowed to look at toe holds and knee bars and calf slicers until they get up to the brown belt level. And so therefore, people don't need to actually really work on stuff until they start getting closer to that point. If they're looking at that rule set, I still think that all leg locks, including heel hooks, should be trained at the very, even at white belt for people, because it can be done safe. But we do people will try and play the game and the rules in the competitions that they're looking to compete at. And IBJJF is at the forefront of that. And so all of a sudden, people are coming out and getting calf sliced, and they're not as developed against it. And then we got to look at people that aren't as flexible. So calf slicer is done with the idea that the person is not flexible enough to be able to eat a calf slicer, because calf slicer is a compression-based lock, and basically all we're doing is we're creating a wedge where we're shoving our shin in behind our opponent's knee, and then we're looking to compress our opponent's heel towards their butt as far as we can, accessing the leg as a lever, and hopefully that person is not flexible enough to be able to bend their leg all the way down to their hips while there is this wedge in place. Unfortunately, a lot of people at higher levels are able to do that. And so when you apply it, because this is where some people really argued with me on my video, is they're like, oh, well, my own knee exploded from a calf slicer. So there's a break where I got actually hurt. So how dare you tell me that calf slicers aren't effective? Well, I don't care that you're a blue belt who's 45 years old, who has a job and a family. You're not the person that I'm trying to aim to achieve at to try and submit here. So it's yes, you have to respect a calf slicer in the same way that I myself have to respect a calf slicer because of my own functional limitations of movement. But if you put Gordon Ryan or Kyotera or Vinny Magalhaes in a calf slicer, you're never going to be able to do anything that causes actual damage to the person, or let alone catastrophic damage where we can actually take that limb out of working use, because that's our goal. We want to be able to, with submissions against the limbs, so when we're looking at joint locks, not just a light pop of something or a tweak of the knee. We need to actually be able to cause catastrophic damage that impedes the person from being able to fight any longer. And even that, we still see varying limits of success with other submissions as well. But as long as we're trying to focus it on the highest, the cream of the crop, on the most flexible and the strongest individuals, then, as I've been saying, then we're covered for everything underneath that. And so we're always trying to look at documented breaks at the highest level and consistent taps. So that's where heel hooks, we see people's knees get absolutely just devastated where they can't go on. But then we still see even the heel hook, where we look at Craig Jones' first Vinny Magalhaes just recently. While he did significantly hurt Vinny, it was, at least so far, it looks like a different part of Vinny's ankle that was injured instead of his knee. And they still talked about it for a while throughout the match before Vinny actually decided they came to agreement to just stop there. Vinny was able to stand up and keep fighting. And so we're going to see, here's someone who's extremely flexible and strong and a talented black belt. And he was able to eat this thing, and it still hurt him devastatingly, but he was still able to stand on it afterwards. You're always going to have certain limited success once we get to the highest level like that. But something like a calf slicer, we never see it at the higher levels. And when we even see it in MMA, then we have to now take into context the grappling experience between the individuals there, because we will have that asymmetrical information between the two, where one person is nowhere near the same grappling level. Maybe it's a striker versus a grappler. Maybe it's two low-level grapplers. Maybe it's a high-level grappler versus a low-level grappler. There's all these variables we got to take into place of why this submission worked. And so we want to see the submissions work, but we also want to see them work consistently, because even calf slicers, there are a few instances of them working at the highest level at black belt. So it's there. It's just something that when we're talking about efficient use of our time, most of us aren't training 40 hours a week and looking to become world champions and doing steroids to be able to keep that training up for years and years. And so when I have people that are only training as hobbyists even, and they're training 2 times a week, maybe 2 hours a session, they don't have time to develop all the different areas of jiu-jitsu or spend time developing an area just to have to throw it away essentially once they get to a certain point. Like, oh, calf slicers did me really good up until brown belt, but now that I'm black belt, I'm going to have to redo this stuff. No, I want them to learn something, a technique, like say a heel hook, effectively at white belt, and then that way they're able to take it with them all the way to black belt, and all they've had to do is continue refining that technique, just like they would their guard passes or their guard retention movements, and they're going to be that much more effective at it, and it's going to be something that they can tap anybody with, and they've never had to get rid of that. And so that's where I think Rob's done such a good job with the F your jiu-jitsu approach, the ways we drill, and the techniques that he will specifically show and what he wants us to spend more time on than others, allows some of our students to be very effective grapplers within like a much shorter time frame. Like when I think of the grappler I was at about 5 years of training, I'm just disgusted when I see some of these guys at 3 months demonstrating stuff and their passing and their guard retention in ways that I just was unable to, because I didn't have that kind of training, because it was before I trained with Rob.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's interesting you bring up the Vinny Magalhaes knee break or ankle break there, because in regards to false positives, because I was thinking about it, and Vinny mentioned that he had really flexible feet, obviously beforehand, and he made leg locks don't work his mantra or his brand. And I was thinking like, okay, if he does have these really flexible feet, he's obviously been getting away with it in training a lot, where people would have been putting him into heel hooks and taking his heel to an awkward angle, and Vinny wasn't having to tap to that, because we can see that the angle that Craig did have to take it to actually get the break.
Oh, ruthless,
right? So in training, people would have been taking it to weird angles and probably thinking, whoa, backing off, and Vinny's not tapping, and he would have been getting that feedback that maybe leg locks don't work. But obviously they do. So that's...
Yeah, and I think like even a mindset of leg locks don't necessarily work as well on me would have been a more honest way of, it doesn't sell as well, obviously, and you don't want to make it into a shirt, but it's like, okay, he could understand, and he always explained that for him, he is extremely flexible and he is very strong, and he's obviously a very technical black belt. So like leg locking Vinny is why he never got submitted for so many years. But most people could look at that and go, no, that is an absolute that is such an outlier of the situation, where like that's rare that we can't even really consider that. Vinny has his own little pocket over there, where something like calf slicers we can look at, and I'm not the only one that says it. Even Ryan Hall in his most recent modern 50-50 instructional said that nobody taps the calf slicer. So it's like, if Ryan says it, then it's more okay. Obviously he's much more he's much more renowned and respected because of his competition experience and what he's done like in the UFC and grappling as a whole with instruction.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It was funny with, you did mention that I put out a video on calf slices, and I think it just happened to be, the same week I put out a video on calf slices in MMA, you happened to put out a video why calf slices are terrible and you should never use them. And I thought that was a complete coincidence, but it's just, it was a funny coincidence nonetheless. And, but
yeah, and then someone could still look at what you had talked about and be like, okay, if I'm competing MMA and that's my goal, we are seeing successive calf slicers in MMA. And so if the person isn't as competent as a grappler, then absolutely calf slicers can be effectively used.
But I still think there is that, the benefit of just looking at the high percentage ones. And the first goal of anyone in MMA should be take the back, choke them out, take them down, pass guard, get the back, choke them out with a rear naked choke.
In MMA where you have so many different things to learn, because you have to now become a jack of all trades with your striking, with your clinch, and with your grappling. Absolutely. Any of those guys that got calf sliced in that, it was great compilation and breakdown that you did, that I bet any one of them could also have been heel hooked. And by practicing heel hooks, you would have gotten all those guys, and then you would have then also created a fail-safe system that now you're going to be able to take it to the higher levels, that when they're competing in higher level MMA events and going up potentially a good leg locker, they're going to be able to have a higher chance to finish them as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'd agree with that. And one thing I've also thought about with that idea of false positives is that classic Bruce Lee saying, roughly, is it, take what's useful to you, discard what's useless, and add uniquely your own. And I kind of feel like now that can be overused for people to justify low percentage moves or things that they get in false positives. They can just turn around and go, it's what Bruce Lee says. It works for me, so I'm gonna keep it in my game. But the way you're approaching it, I think, makes a lot more sense. Not that I'm saying Bruce Lee's wrong. I just think that phrase is kind of being repurposed for a lot of people to just train stuff that doesn't have that high percentage utility. And so one thing we've talked about your your jiu-jitsu, the concepts and and ways to drill techniques. So when people are just doing the traditional drilling in your class, what would be, is it like we've seen most people would drill in their school, or is there something just about your traditional drilling when you guys are getting in reps that you do differently, or that you think most people should be doing that they aren't?
It's not too much different. Obviously, when we're teaching, we teach systems of anything. So it's always interconnected techniques. And so whether we have modules that go through the fundamentals every week or sometimes 2 weeks. And then for our more advanced, it's 1 month modules where if we're going to be talking about Kimura control, we're doing only Kimuras for the entire month so that people are going to be able to keep stacking upon techniques. So when we get people to drill, they're first shown a technique, and we really emphasize the idea that it's not just one person drilling at a time, like the usual, where you have like the person perform the move and the uke. You have both people getting better together. So we need to have the training partner, whether it's just knowing the proper, like if say we're doing close guard and I'm going to teach some close guard stuff, I need the person on top to also know how to properly put themselves in alignment in close guard and be able to like create a little bit of resistance and know how to effectively respond, so that the person who's drilling close guard is going to be able to do it against somebody who's a better training partner, rather than somebody who's like you see it sometimes like the person who kind of lays on their back like a dead fish because it's no longer their turn to do the guard passing. And so they're given just the crappiest feedback or no feedback at all, and just starfished out while their partner is kind of doing Toriando passes and stuff like that, which isn't very good. So we want to make sure that both people are engaged and trying to learn something at the same time. Then we like to have at least a minimum of 5 to 10 reps each that the students do before they switch. And I think that's probably the biggest like change. Not that it's like the monumental difference, but I really dislike classes where people only do 1 move each or 2 moves each, and then they switch turns. Like if they're doing a sweep where it's like, oh, you sweep me, and then because I'm on my back, I'll now sweep you back, and we'll just go back and forth like that. I think the brain needs to switch into like a learning mode as it's doing it. And so for me, speaking from my own experience, sometimes the first or second rep of your set can just suck. even if you're midway in the class, it's just not technically the best that it could be. And so by taking the time to do 5 reps before switching with your partner, or upwards of 10 reps before switching, just allows you to keep dialing it in more and more. It just becomes too disjointed when you're just doing 1 rep or 2 reps and then handing it back to your partner and allowing them to do it. It certainly, like, I get why some people do it because it keeps the 2 people actively jumping in, but it doesn't take that long to just do like 5 reps consistently or 10 reps consistently, providing you're not just like talking the whole time. Like some people aren't the best when it comes to drilling, but just dedicated 5-10 reps, bang them out. It can be slow or it can be faster, and then switch. And that part is huge there. And then we just, the same thing where it's drilling. We will drill 1 technique or 2 techniques for an entire class. So if you came into my class and I'm going to be teaching you like the tripod sweep, I'm going to teach you the tripod sweep, and you're going to spend probably about 20 minutes doing just that. And then we're going to clean up the actual technical stand-up part of finishing the sweep once your partner has fallen to the ground, and then maybe a slight variation on that. But typically it'll be just a tripod sweep, and then more emphasis spent on also finishing the sweep coming up and possibly putting yourself into a great position to start passing immediately off of it. I don't like classes that also then show you 20 different techniques, or something that seminars are notorious for, where you go to a seminar and you just get bombarded with like 20 techniques within a 3-hour class. And then at the end of it, it's like, holy crap, I have no idea what I'm supposed to take away from that anymore. I've forgotten everything.
Yeah, for me, definitely the best seminars I've been to are ones that just focus on just one move, one position, and you just end up spending, an hour or 2 just focusing on that. And that's really noticeable now that I've done, a fair few seminars over the years, that the stuff I can remember is going to be from those seminars that are structured like that. And the best I can remember from seminars that just show a lot of different moves is just little dribs and drabs of stuff there. So yeah, I agree with you on that one. So it's been a good chat, Rory. And I just want to, finishing up, just some advice you can give to people on if you were to go back and meet yourself when you first started training martial arts, or, training as a white belt, what would be a piece of advice that you could give yourself back then that you think would help you learn faster, or just would be a good advice overall?
Oh man, that could be a whole bunch of different things, all the mistakes I've made in my life. Focusing on the part that I think has been most important to me now, especially even as a black belt, but what's really helped me, and I had Rob there fortunately to guide me, was what we've been talking about of making sure that we're practicing legit techniques that are proven. Try and stay away from chasing the YouTube rabbit hole, instructionals necessarily, or especially Instagram videos. Now, there are good channels, like obviously if you want to check out Sonny's channel or my channel, like there's going to be some good stuff there, but just at least be hesitant on where you're trying to get all like the information from, because there's a lot of crap out there. Obviously learning a conceptual approach will give you a framework for being able to have the ability to identify bullshit that's out there, but watch competition and see like what these guys are doing at the highest levels. And if you have some amazing move that you've never seen at the highest level, the reality is that it's probably crap, that what you're doing. And it can be kind of defeating, because I find a lot of people get really attached to their techniques, and then they get offended when we tell them that those techniques aren't valid at the highest level. And like you're saying, where it's like people, you just have that technique that you're working on at the gym and you have success with it. But some people really grab onto that stuff and they become resistant to change. They're just techniques. They're just tools that we can use. And so watch the stuff that's being used at the highest level and use that as the filtration of knowing what works. Because if it's going to work on, if like Gordon Ryan gets submitted with something, then absolutely it's going to work on everybody underneath him, including that drunk guy that you run into at the bar, if you're able to make that work. So yeah, just make sure, try and not go down these rabbit holes of practicing all these wacky, crazy techniques. We have a filtration process in jiu-jitsu, and it's quite easy to see what actually works out there.
Yeah, that's beautiful advice. I think that everyone can benefit from that. Even I know that I spend time working on techniques that for sure the time's better spent in other areas. And maybe next time I can get you to come back on and we can discuss submissions 101 and the pentagram choke a little bit.
Yeah, I got lots to say about submissions 101. Well, during this whole COVID-19 thing, we certainly have the time to do another one of these or more.
I think that'd be a funny discussion to go over that. So, but we'll save that for another day, because I'm sure you got a lot to say on that. And if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do it? Obviously, your YouTube channel, which I highly recommend everyone goes and checks out. But I also know you've got a few instructionals on sale or just to buy if people are looking for those.
Yeah, so my YouTube channel, RVV BJJ, is where I do most of my work. That's got me, I guess, any little bit of notoriety around in the small part of the Jiu-Jitsu community. I work with my instructor, Rob Bernacki, on bjjconcepts.net, in which he does an amazing stuff that I've been talking about in a very well set up way with curriculums for you to be able to learn from. I have a guard retention formula with Stefan Kesting, and I have some instructionals that I've been doing, about 14 or 15 instructionals at this point, with Gold BJJ, which is an excellent company. They have an online training academy, but I also have to really recommend their products. They're some of my favorite products that I've ever got to use for gis and backpacks and stuff like that. And best way to reach me just for like messages is Instagram or Facebook, whether it's my personal Facebook account or my RVV BJJ Facebook account. Especially right now, a lot of downtime, I'm always on there. So if you guys have any questions about anything, I'm happy to chat about really anything at this point.
Beautiful. Thanks. I'll put all the links to those in the show notes if people want to check them out. And thanks so much for your time, Rory. Hopefully we can do it again in the future.
That sounds perfect, Sonny. Let's do it again.
You have been listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Until next time, you can visit sonnybrown.net to find out more ways to break it down.